The year is 1621. In a small village nestled within the dark forests of Würzburg, Germany, a crowd gathers in chilling silence. The morning fog clings low, mingling with the rising smoke of the pyre. At its center stands a woman barefoot, trembling, eyes wide with disbelief. She has been accused of witchcraft. There is no proof, no spells, no curses, only whispers, fear, and the testimony of a neighbor whose cow stopped giving milk. The executioner tightens the ropes as priests chant Latin verses. Children watch as the flames are lit, their innocent faces twisted in confusion. Within minutes, her screams pierce the silence, echoing off the stone walls and into the woods beyond. This is not an isolated case. It's the beginning of one of the most disturbing chapters in European history. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, tens of thousands of women across Europe were accused, tortured, and killed in the name of religion, morality, and fear. In some regions, entire towns turned against their daughters, wives, and mothers. Witchcraft was not just a superstition. It was a political weapon, a religious tool, and a reflection of deep societal paranoia. Women, especially the poor, widowed, outspoken, simply different, became scapegoats. And it wasn't just the uneducated masses fueling this hysteria. Scholars, nobles, and even kings believed in witches. Entire legal systems were constructed to identify, interrogate, and execute them. But why? Why were women burned alive for crimes no one could see? This documentary dives into that nightmare. Through court records, letters, and testimonies, we will uncover the terrifying truth behind the witch trials. From Germany to Scotland, France, to Switzerland, the horror was widespread and systematic. This was no fantasy. This was a slow, brutal genocide of women under the guise of spiritual purity that left deep scars in the conscience of Europe. Welcome to the truth behind the witch hunts. It didn't start with fire. It started with fear. In the late Middle Ages, Europe was a continent in crisis. Plagues wiped out millions. Famine stalked the countryside. Political unrest, religious wars, and natural disasters seemed like divine punishment. People searched for answers and found them in the darkest corners of their imagination. The church began preaching that Satan was not only real, but active, walking among them through human agents. These agents, they said, were witches, but fear alone wasn't enough to spark mass persecution. The real fire came from the pens of scholars and clergy. In 1487, two German inquisitors published a book that would change history, the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. It claimed women were more likely to serve the devil because they were weaker, more lustful, and intellectually inferior. The book became a bestseller across Europe, second only to the Bible. Judges and inquisitors used it as a manual. The book taught how to identify witches, how to interrogate them, and how to justify their execution even without confession. It was brutal, misogynistic, and terrifyingly effective. Soon, the law caught up with the hysteria. In towns and cities, courts were established specifically to try witchcraft cases. Torture was legalized to extract confessions. Sleep deprivation, thumbscrews, leg crushers, anything to make a woman confess to flying with demons or poisoning crops. And once one woman confessed, the madness spread like wildfire. She'd name others friends, neighbors, even her own children just to stop the pain. Entire communities were torn apart. Suspicion replaced trust. Families were destroyed by accusation. And behind it all was a system, legal, religious, cultural, designed to hunt witches, but in truth, designed to crush women. The witch hunts weren't random. They were organized, were sanctioned, were policy, and they were just getting started. Once a woman was accused of witchcraft, her fate was nearly sealed. The next step was interrogation, an elegant word hiding a monstrous reality. Torture was not a last resort. It was standard procedure. Authorities believed that no woman would confess to witchcraft unless her soul had been pried open by pain. The methods were as cruel as they were creative. The strapado was common. The accused woman's hands were tied behind her back. Then she was hoisted into the air by a rope and dropped violently. The joints in her shoulders often dislocated on the first drop. If she screamed, that was taken as evidence she was hiding something. Then there was the thumb screw, which crushed the fingers one turn at a time. Iron boots were heated until flesh blistered. Needles were driven under fingernails. Bodies were stretched on racks. Sometimes accused witches were forced to sit in scalding hot iron chairs for hours. Every cry, every whimper, every plea was used against them. Silence. That too was suspicious. And then came the infamous swimming test. Women were tied up and thrown into rivers. If they floated, it meant the water considered pure was rejecting them. Guilty. If they sank, they were innocent, but often drowned before they could be pulled out. These tortures didn't seek truth. They sought confession. Many women confessed, just to stop the pain, admitting to flying on broomsticks, dancing with the devil, or cursing crops things they had never imagined before. Some even gave the names of others, just to make the agony end. Confessions obtained under torture became the foundation for entire trials. And once one woman was forced to name others, the hunt spread like wildfire, which hunts fed on pain. The more pain inflicted, the more witches emerged. Entire communities spiraled into madness, each new confession feeding the flames. And the twisted irony, confession didn't save the accused, it only sealed their doom. They were marched to execution, often thanking God the torture was over. Their bodies broken, their spirits shattered, they faced their deaths not as monsters, but as victims of a system designed to destroy them. In medieval and early modern Europe, religion wasn't just a belief, it was law, order, and reality itself. The church dictated how people lived, how they died, and how they explained everything in between. But when fear entered that system, it twisted into something dark and deadly. The devil became more than a symbol of evil, became a real stalking force, blamed for every misfortune, crop failures, miscarriages, disease, outbreaks, even bad weather. And the church believed he didn't work alone. He had agents. Witches' clergy preached fiery sermons about invisible enemies among them. Witches are everywhere, they warned. They walk among us, smiling, deceiving, cursing your children. That fear was absorbed into the very souls of the people. Every woman who was odd, poor, beautiful, old, widowed, or too intelligent became a potential suspect. The idea of witches wasn't new, but the church gave it structure, rules, and purpose. Witchcraft became heresy, the ultimate sin, accusing. Someone of witchcraft wasn't just about a personal grudge, was now a holy mission. Rooting out witches was seen as saving souls. Priests joined witch trials, not as defenders of mercy, but as prosecutors of the damned. Religious texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, written by inquisitors, spread through Europe, explaining how to identify, torture, and punish witches. It became the go-to manual for persecutors. Ironically, the church believed it was cleansing society by burning women alive. They thought they were doing God's work. Fire was not just a punishment. It was purification. The devil's influence, they said, had to be purged by flame. But in truth, this wasn't faith. It was fear weaponized. People were taught to believe that evil could be passed through touch, through glances, even through dreams. If a cow died, it wasn't natural. If a child fell sick, someone had to be blamed. And in every town, there was a woman alone, misunderstood, who became the target. Faith had become blind, deaf, and cruel. Instead of comfort, the church offered accusations instead of sanctuary, built pyres, and as thousands of women burned in the name of righteousness, the true evil went unnoticed, the transformation of faith into fanaticism. Once a woman was accused of witchcraft, the outcome was almost always the same. Truth didn't matter. Evidence didn't matter. What mattered was the confession, and they would get one, no matter the cost. Torture wasn't a last resort. It was the first step. Across Europe, witch hunters developed horrific tools and methods to extract the truth. Women were stripped, bound, beaten, stretched, burned, and mutilated, all under the justification that the devil would only confess through pain. The more they screamed, the more guilty they appeared. The witch's mark was a common excuse for torture, examined by so-called experts. Women's bodies were poked and pierced in search of a devil's kiss, a spot that didn't bleed or hurt. Moles, freckles, birthmarks, even scars from childbirth were used as proof of demonic alliance. It was a trap. Your body itself was your guilt. The rack stretched limbs until joints popped. The thumbscrew crushed fingers to pulp. The stripetto lifted women by their wrists, dislocating shoulders. Iron chairs, heated red hot. Scorched flesh while interrogators shouted scripture. And if a woman survived torture without confessing, it was seen as more evidence she had supernatural strength. Under such unbearable agony, many women said whatever was needed to make it stop. They admitted to flying, summoning storms, killing livestock, cursing children. They named other women. And so the madness spread like fire, one false confession leading to another, and another. Entire villages were torn apart this way. Mothers turned against daughters, friends betrayed friends. Even children were forced to testify against their own mothers. Worse still, the torturers believed they were saving souls. The confession, they said, was a path to repentance. Better to burn in this world, they claimed, than in the next. But in truth, these were not spiritual men. They were executioners in the robes of priests and judges. No woman was safe. And once accused, the end was almost certain. The courtroom was not a place for justice. It was a theater of fear. The cries of women echoed in dungeons while crowds above awaited the next burning in the name of salvation. Its mercy had died, and in its place rose a brutal machine fueled by paranoia, superstition, and the unbearable screams of the innocent. Once the confession was torn from her lips through pain, coercion, or pure exhaustion, the fate of the accused was sealed. There would be no mercy, no reprieve. The verdict was predetermined, guilty. The sentence was death by fire, burning. At the stake was not just a punishment, it was a message. In village squares and city courtyards across Europe, pyres were built with terrifying precision. Wood was stacked beneath tall poles. Iron chains or ropes were tied near the top, where the accused would be bound. A crowd always gathered. Children, elders, merchants, they came as if it were a festival. But what they witnessed was horror. The condemned woman, often weak from torture or stripped of dignity, was dragged out for the final act. Sometimes she was gagged to silence her prayers. Other times, her last words were ignored cries to God, declarations of innocence. Pleas for her children. Then came the flames. The fire started slow licking at the wood, teasing the edges of her dress, but it soon grew into an inferno. Smoke choked her cries. Her skin blistered, the air filled with a sickening mix of ash, hair, and burned cloth. Spectators claimed they saw demons in the smoke. They said the devil screamed as she burned. But the truth was far simpler. A woman died in agony because a frightened society needed a scapegoat. Executioners, often masked or hidden, claimed they were purifying her soul. Church leaders called it divine justice. But the truth was darker. Burning was meant to erase her completely. No burial, no tombstone, no just dust on the wind. In some places, if the woman repented before her execution, she was strangled or hanged first, then burned. But others were not so merciful. Cities burned women alive intentionally, believing the suffering was part of her redemption. For the audience, it became theater. Moral instruction through brutality. See what happens to witches? They whispered to their daughters. Stay obedient, stay silent. The pyres consumed more than just bodies. They consumed innocence, compassion, justice as the smoke rose. So did the lie that this was God's will. But deep in the hearts of many who watched, especially the women, something else began to burn: fear, grief, and eventually anger. One of the most painful truths of the witch trials is this: women often accused other women. In a world where female voices were already silenced, trials turned women against each other. Mothers, daughters, neighbors, and midwives all were vulnerable, all were suspects. Sometimes, all became accusers. It didn't always begin with hatred. Sometimes it began with fear. Imagine a widow, barely surviving, accused of casting a curse on a neighbor's child. The inquisitor leans in and whispers, "Tell us who else is a witch, and you may live." That was the deal. Lie and survive. Or stay silent and burn. So names were spoken. Sister, a friend. A woman who once gave bitter herbs to soothe fever. The line between betrayal and survival blurred. The trials created a cruel chain reaction. One confession led to 10 more. Accusations multiplied like wildfire. The more women were tortured into naming others, the larger the net grew. With each new victim came more desperation. More lies in this twisted system. Women's knowledge became their curse. Herbalists, midwives, and caretakers, once valued for their skills, were now targets. A woman who knew too much about the body or childbirth became suspicious. Died during birth, it must be her fault. If it survived when others didn't, maybe she used magic. Even among friends, fear spread like a plague. Women stopped helping one another, stopped gathering, stopped speaking openly. The trials had done something monstrous, not only burning bodies, but destroying trust. This is what made the persecution so efficient. The judges and church didn't need to find witches. The women would do it for them. Some women confessed to crimes they never committed just to end the torture. Others turned to neighbors who were odd, outspoken, or merely poor. And some, tragically, came to believe that they themselves were evil, that their dreams, their thoughts, their bleeding wounds were evidence of sin. The witch hunts were not just an attack on individuals. They were an attack on sisterhood, on community, on the idea that women could ever be safe among each other. It fractured generations. And in many villages it left behind silence, silence more terrifying than fire. Behind every witch trial, there was someone gaining power, someone profiting from the chaos. The witch hunters were not just zealous believers, they were often businessmen in disguise, exploiting fear for gold. Many parts of Europe, especially. In Germany and Scotland, men made careers out of hunting witches. The more witches they found, the more they were paid. One notorious example is Matthew Hopkins, a self-proclaimed witch-finder, general of England during the 1640s. He wasn't a judge, wasn't a priest. He had no legal authority. But he traveled from town to town, identifying witches, charging fees for each discovery. His methods were cruel, his standards low. If a woman had a mole, she could be condemned. If she didn't cry during interrogation, she was cold-hearted, a sure sign of guilt. Hopkins and others like him used torture disguised as tests. They'd throw women into rivers to see if they floated. They'd jab needles into their skin to find devil's marks. These trials were rigged. Innocence was nearly impossible to prove. And what of the possessions of these so-called witches? Once convicted, their land, their homes, their livestock all were confiscated. The church, the local lords, and the hunters themselves often shared the spoils. Killing witches became profitable. It fed the economy of fear. In cities like Bamberg and Würzburg in Germany, the witch craze became institutional. There were even witch-hunting manuals guides that told officials how to interrogate, torture, and extract confessions. One infamous book, Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches, written in 1487, instructed inquisitors to show no mercy. It warned that leniency toward witches was treason against God. This machinery of persecution wasn't chaotic, it was organized, systematic, and fueled by wealth, ego, and fanaticism. The more people believed in witches, the more they turned to these experts to find and destroy them, and in doing so, they created a monster that fed on the vulnerable. Poor women, lonely women, healers, widows, anyone who didn't fit in. What began as superstition turned into a business. The executions increased, so did the power of those behind them. The witch hunters didn't just ignite the flames, they built the furnace. By the late 1700s, the fires of the witch trials began to die down, but not because the world suddenly became kind. The Enlightenment had arrived. Thinkers across Europe began questioning old beliefs. Scientists, philosophers, and reformers challenged the idea that misfortune came from magic. Disease had causes. Weather had patterns. Death had science. Not sorcery, but for thousands of women. That realization came too late. In 1782, a Swiss woman named Anna Glady was executed for witchcraft. One of the last confirmed judicial killings for witchcraft in Europe. Her crime? A servant girl in the household where she worked had fallen mysteriously ill. Anna was accused of poisoning the girl through supernatural means. Though torture was used to extract her confession, the courts found a way to sentence her under poisoning laws to hide the embarrassing truth. They were still burning witches in the age of reason. Her story is not unique in Poland. In the town of Doroco, a group of women were accused of sorcery as late as 1783 in this supposedly modern world. They were stripped, beaten, and publicly burned all in front of cheering crowds. And in some rural parts of Europe, which killings persisted into the 19th century, not by courts, but by mobs, lynchings, stonings,